The Game Boy Advance was a very beloved handheld, and it arose at a time where there was some competition in the handheld gaming market, but none actually towards the Game Boy Advance when it came to its overwhelming third-party support and incredible first-party library. Now, taking a look back at Nintendo's biggest offerings at the time, the GameCube was Nintendo's worst-selling console throughout its run, with no hope of outselling the PlayStation 2 or even the Xbox. But the Game Boy Advance was completely dominating the handheld market. Even though the Game Boy Advance was such a popular handheld because of its library, the hardware did leave a lot to be desired. This pushed Nintendo to make a very quick jump into the next generation of handheld gaming, although they intended their next offering to coexist with the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube as a third line of products. However, this release was so unbelievably successful for Nintendo that it completely changed the way they tackled every gaming device they made for generations to come. And it all came out in 2004. This is the Nintendo DS, my favorite gaming handheld ever. The Nintendo DS originally released as a device that would live alongside the Game Boy line and home consoles as a third pillar. It made sense that they would feel this way, as the DS is completely different from what Nintendo has even hinted at doing in the past. The Nintendo DS holds a lot of the DNA from the Game Boy Advance, and even actually one of Nintendo's own devices from decades ago, the dual-screen Game & Watch. The DS has a clamshell in order to accommodate having its biggest feature, the dual screens, but there are many more additions to this device. We have a clicky D-pad that's similar to the Game Boy Advance SP's D-pad, but it is slightly larger. We also get ABXY for the first time on any Nintendo handheld. These buttons were also pretty clicky, and this applies to the rest of the buttons, including the power, start, and select buttons, which were all moved to the top of this bottom section. In this area, we also get a microphone and some LED indicators. This microphone will definitely come in handy a little bit later. Then the speakers are actually located on the top, and they are now stereo speakers, which is a great improvement to the playing experience compared to the Game Boy Advance. On the top, you get your L and R shoulder buttons, a charger connector, which is exactly the same as the Game Boy Advance SP's charging port, a brand new cartridge slot, a hole for a lanyard, and a brand new stylus. Then on the bottom, you get a headphone jack, a Game Boy Advance cartridge slot, and volume controls. So getting into those two displays that we have with the DS, we get dual 4x3 256 by 192 resolution LCD displays that are only slightly higher resolution than the Game Boy Advance SP screen by just a few pixels. These screens are pretty much identical, but the bottom is quite special. This is a fully touch-enabled screen, and it comes with a stylus to make drawing and navigating easier. You can use your fingers too if you want, but this in and of itself unlocks so many possibilities in terms of the games that you can play. As for the hardware, this is quite the system. This is bulky, uneven, and even hefty. This device feels great, but it was definitely pretty large for a pocketable device. When I first received this device in the mail for this video, I was surprised by this strong hinge mechanism that it clicks so aggressively into place. This even feels premium, with not that much wobbling, at least on my unit. This is a very solid device. So upon turning the DS on, you will be greeted with a setup screen where you enter your details such as your name, birthday, time of day, and more, just to be taken to the DS's main menu. We have never seen this before on any Nintendo handheld, and it felt so incredibly modern, especially with that soft chime that it produces as soon as you enter. Within this menu, there are a few things that you can do. You can turn the backlight on or off, but I would just leave it on as I can't see anything at all when it's off. You can also access those same settings from before and even calibrate your bottom touchscreen if needed. You can even add alarms if you want to. This feels like more of a personal device when you do so. Then you have the ability to use Download Play, which allows you to download data from a neighboring device to enjoy multiplayer features within just a single cartridge. And of course, there is PictoChat. This was a massive gimmick, but one built-in feature that allows you to use the bottom touchscreen and the included stylus as much as possible. You can send messages by using the keyboard or by drawing out a message, although this only works locally. I remember the first time that I got a DS and how I typed in a message, perfectly spelled and everything back in the 5th grade. And then I sent it to my friend, talking about how we should schedule a time to chat proactively at 12 p.m. He lived in the city, I lived in a small town, so that message obviously never reached him. But this feature was really cool. By the way, the DS has Wi-Fi capabilities, but they are very limited, just pretty much to only games that support it for obtaining content or connecting with friends for multiplayer. I mentioned earlier that the DS has a Game Boy Advance slot at the bottom, and this is because this device is fully compatible with all Game Boy Advance games and it doesn't play them through emulation, but instead it plays them natively. This is actually the best way of playing Game Boy Advance games, in my opinion. You can decide which display you want to play with, such as the top or the bottom one, and it was a genuinely awesome experience. On top of that, the DS is fully wireless, so you won't need a link cable to play with anyone else. And that's exactly why it was so puzzling that this was going to be a third pillar of Nintendo's hardware lineup, when this is exactly the best Game Boy Advance that they've made, rendering the other models kind of obsolete. These GBA cartridges even sit perfectly flush in this slot, but there is one thing that we do lose with the DS regarding backwards compatibility. The DS cannot play Game Boy or Game Boy Color games at all. These cartridges don't hold at all, which means that Nintendo is now ready to move on from the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, unfortunately. But speaking of moving on, Nintendo is making new kinds of cartridges for the DS. These DS cartridges are really small and they come with some neat improvements. When you insert them, you get a very nice and satisfying click, same as when you remove them, making this a smoother insertion and removal procedure. Additionally, these cartridges are a lot easier to carry and they don't depend on any batteries for any reason, including time-based events, because it uses the internal clock built onto the DS, and that one doesn't have a time expectancy like how batteries did on cartridges. This was a much needed change and we finally have it. These cartridges can also hold up to 512 megabytes of data, not quite as much as a CD, but definitely more sizable than the 64 megabyte limit from Game Boy Advance cartridges. And one big point of contention with the DS is that the battery life is suboptimal. The DS lasts anywhere between 6 to 10 hours, which for a handheld was actually pretty low at the time. With all of this in mind, Nintendo DS launched at $149, being quite reasonable in its price. The Nintendo DS's hardware was very impressive as it showed new ways of gaming that no other console maker had attempted to address. The DS was so leaps and bounds ahead of what the Game Boy Advance could do, and because of that touchscreen, we had so many and incredibly fun experiences that could only be found on the Nintendo DS. Emulators to this day still can't match the experience. These are the games that made the Nintendo DS an absolute juggernaut of entertainment. A big focus for the Nintendo DS is now rendering 3D graphics consistently. If you owned a Game Boy Advance, then you may or may have not come across pseudo 3D graphics in some games, but it was always very limited and it did not look great, while also feeling really sluggish. But the DS can now render 3D properly, including the use of textures, environments, characters, and much more. The DS actually had two engines for rendering 3D and 2D graphics. This 2D engine was quite a substantial improvement from what the Game Boy Advance had, even if some of these aspects remained about the same. The DS was very capable, but it wasn't the easiest console to program for, particularly in terms of 2D graphics based on how its resources were allocated. The 3D engine did also come with its own set of compromises, but somehow developers managed to create some absolutely incredible games, both 2D and 3D, that absolutely helps to sell the DS over its life cycle, squeezing every bit of feature set available on this hardware. The Nintendo DS launched with a few games in 2004, but the one that I would like to talk about is Super Mario 64 DS. This is a remake of the original, highly beloved classic, Super Mario 64 from 1996 for the Nintendo 64. This game added updated models, updated textures, and new playable characters such as Luigi, Wario, and Yoshi. This game did benefit from using the bottom screen as we got the mini-map and camera controls. This is one of many ways that DS games made use of the bottom screen, while others relied on it much more, if not completely. Some Something like Nintendogs was something that made great use of the touchscreen when it came to petting, bathing, and doing everything needed with your pets. You could even use the microphone to call on your pet to get its attention. But there were truly no shortage of games on this platform. Some of the best games ever released for the Nintendo DS include the Chrono Trigger re-release, which was a very beloved game during the SNES era and it made a fantastic return during the DS era. We also get a 3D Mario Kart, Legend of Zelda, Phantom Hourglass, GTA Chinatown Wars, Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow, New Super Mario Bros., Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, Sonic Rush, and Rush Adventure, The World Ends With You. We even got 2 Final Fantasy 3D remakes in the form of Final Fantasy 3 and Final Fantasy 4 of which is considered to be the most difficult version of the game, for those who want a challenge. We even saw Metroid Prime be introduced to their handheld line with the first Hunt. This is also when we start seeing Pokemon Ranger games, which made great use of the touchscreen and is actually a very fun series of games. But no Nintendo handheld is complete without a mention of every mainline Pokemon game. The DS was home to 2 full generations of Pokemon games, with Diamond and Pearl being the first mainline games that we saw on the DS. Then we received a much needed update to this bumpy introduction of the 4th generation of Pokemon through Pokemon Platinum. This is actually my favorite Pokemon game of all time. Then we received Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which are considered to be some of the best, if not the best, Pokemon games ever made. At least, they are the fan favorite remakes of older Pokemon games. We also got Pokemon Black and White, which looked absolutely beautiful in every way and has fully animated 2D sprites for every single Pokemon introduced to this generation. This is back when Game Freak was far from lazy and put their all into these Pokemon releases. Black 2 and White 2 were also very well received sequels to those two, giving the 5th generation of Pokemon a proper send-off. Now, some of my personal favorites were Dragon Ball Z Super Sonic Warriors 2, as it was a huge visual and roster upgrade. But we also got a bunch of Naruto games back then, with some bad ones like Naruto, Ninja Destiny, but some of my most nostalgic games like Naruto Path of the Ninja 2. We also got Kingdom Hearts 358 over 2 days, which was my first Kingdom Hearts game and experience overall. It featured an amazing soundtrack and a very fun combat system, even if the controls were clunky. Cooking Mama was also so much fun, and it made really good use of the touchscreen and microphones, offering unforgettable experiences. But of course, the amount of games that I mentioned only begin to describe how vast and awesome the DS's lineup of games were, ranging from JRPGs to fighting games to minigame themed games, life simulators like the Herbs, Sims, and Animal Crossing, lots of Kirby, lots of Mario, Professor Layton, Dragon Quest, among so many others. This was such an amazing platform for great handheld experiences, and unique ones at that. The Nintendo DS really was an awesome product that took the world by storm, but it wasn't just Nintendo trying to dominate the handheld market this time around, because Sony jumped in just 1 year later. They released the PSP, PlayStation Portable, in 2005, and that handheld was very successful because it was clearly more powerful than the DS, many saying that the graphics were closer to a PlayStation 2 than to a PlayStation 1. This was very impressive for a handheld, and Nintendo needed to make a push to compete. While the DS did have lots of great games on it, one of the things that actually makes this generation of handheld gaming so unique is that we got so many revisions to the DS line. The first revision that we received came in the form of my favorite handheld ever, the DS Lite, the sleekest design you could have possibly come across in 2006. The DS Lite was an amazing redesign in quite a few ways, and it changed many things for the better at the launch price of only $129. The footprint was made much smaller, and now it has a more uniform look, replacing its matte texture paint coating from before with this glossy look. We now see the 2 boxes that represent the screens of the DS as the logo. The LED indicators were moved to the upper right hinge area. The top contains a brand new charging port that's much smaller and technically works with mini USB, even if it is proprietary, but you have to force it in for it to work. Don't do this, ever. There's also the same cartridge slot and some holes for a lanyard. On the bottom we have a volume slider, which is easier to access, the cartridge slot for GBA games, and it now includes a dust cover for when you're not using it. Next to it, there is a headphone jack, the stylus slot, and power slider removed to the right side of the DS Lite. I actually don't know if I did prefer the slider over the power button, but I definitely prefer having the stylus slot here and having a larger stylus for that matter. The stylus is much easier to handle bezel, and it has a more rounded tip that feels smoother to use with your DS. The one on the original DS model was very small and easier to lose, so this is a very welcome update. Then when you open the DS Lite, you're immediately greeted by a much more modern design and a lot of quality of life updates. The D-pad wasn't bad, but most of us do prefer the softer, high-travel D-pad design that we've gotten for many years before the Game Boy Advance SP, and now we have an awesome D-pad that feels quite fluid to use. The face buttons were made to look much nicer and also have more travel, feeling better to press. The start and select buttons were moved to the bottom, which is also a very welcome addition. The microphone is now sitting at the hinge between both displays, and I do prefer this placement. But the screens received a nice update as well. These screens are more vibrant and they get brighter. Not to mention that now the brightness button allows you to switch between different brightness levels instead of just on or off, but you can't turn off the backlight anymore. That's not something I miss though. With this model, we even get much better battery life, with it now lasting anywhere between 15 to 19 hours. This is a huge boost in battery life. With this amazingly sleek design, especially when it comes to the jet black model, this really feels like the device of the future. The DS now looks more serious and even more professional. This is my favorite DS design out of all of them, hands down. But there are two things that I do not like about the DS Lite, and those are the only two things I would change. Number one, the Game Boy Advance slot no longer lets the cartridge sit flush with the device, and it only sits halfway, which is not an elegant solution, even if I do appreciate that we do have this at all. Number two, the hinge is easily the first thing that breaks on this model specifically. That's actually how I eventually lost my first DS Lite. The hinge just became more and more loose over time, and it wouldn't hold in place. It became so loose at one point that I had to hold the screen up for hours on end while playing, just so that the display wouldn't disconnect from the DS while I played. The solution only held up for a little while, of course. With those two things aside, this device is really nicely built and designed. The DS Lite really was an incredible inclusion to the DS line, and this model specifically was incredibly popular. However, the PSP isn't the only handheld device competing with the DS Lite. Just later into 2007 and even 2008, there had been many smartphones on the market already, but the release of the first iPhone was revolutionary for the smartphone market, and it even affected the gaming handheld market because you could download so many games for free or even just very cheap and do everything else that you needed. So the DS had to compete with phones, believe it or not. As such, they updated their DS line and gave us the DSi in 2008 in Japan, then worldwide in April of 2009. The DSi released with even more quality of life updates. Now we have a slightly longer device than the DS Lite. It's slightly thinner than the Lite, and it now features a matte texture design. Considering that, as beautiful as the DS Lite was, it was a fingerprint magnet. The DSi does feel really nice in hand. On the bottom, you will only find a headphone jack. Then on the top, you will find your shoulder buttons, which are now clickier. We also have a new charging port that never changed on the DS line since we saw it on the DSi. A cartridge slot for the DS games, and some holes for a lanyard. The volume controls were replaced with volume buttons and were moved to the left side, while the right side has a stylus slot and an SD card slot. This is because now we have the ability to store content and games onto your DSi internally, and they definitely deserve praise for not using proprietary storage like the PSP did. So opening this up, you will be greeted by the same buttons layout. The D-pad is back to being clicky and more recessed, and the face buttons are also getting the same treatment. Start and select became a little harder to press, and now we have a power button once more. But of course, I've danced around this fact for long enough. The biggest change with the DSi is the inclusion of front and rear-facing cameras. Now you can take pictures and videos, including selfies, which was a big deal and a gimmick that became a selling point for the DSi, considering how front and rear-facing cameras on mobile devices were a pretty recent development. But of course, these cameras were terrible and aged very quickly, as they could only record at 480p, and these were only 0.3 megapixel sensors. Laughable by today's standards, but back then it was a genuinely awesome inclusion. But on the bright side, the DSi has even nicer screens that get brighter, which is always welcome. But of course, this did come with a significant battery drain, which meant that your device could last anywhere between 4 to 12 hours, depending on your brightness settings. The DSi also has an actual operating system with a revamped menu system. You can view all of your downloaded content, access to cameras, sound recording settings, an actual web browser, a DSi shop for purchasing games and other downloadable content, as well as my favorite feature, Flipnote Studio. This app allows you to create short flip notes, and I had so much fun doing this because the drawing experience feels smoother, but it also lets you use different colors. Finally, you only got a handful of colors, but this was enough to bring me joy for a while. It's also worth mentioning that the DSi was only a mid-generation update, even if it seemingly has a lot of new features. There were also some DSi exclusive games that you could only get by downloading them on the DSi, but you could also get many DS games and download them onto your device that way. This felt quite like the modern boost here, and people did like it because it added some of the features that we would see with the iPhone and other smartphones at the time, as the DSi really had to push hard in order to earn its spot into your pockets. The DSi also had a more difficult time competing because it did eliminate certain features that were important to many. The Game Boy Advance slot is a big one here. With the exclusion of the Game Boy Advance slot, it became impossible to play your GBA games on the DSi, so you had to say goodbye to that game's library. Additionally, other DS games were affected too, including a Guitar Hero game that used an accessory that attached to this slot. You can't play this anymore, but most importantly, avid Pokemon players lost the ability to migrate their Pokemon from the Game Boy Advance Pokemon games over to their DS copies. This was devastating. But the DSi was a very cool system, and one that I do remember still wanting as a kid, as all of these little features made it seem so much better than it actually was. Understandably, it launched at $169, which is higher than both the original and the Lite models. The DSi would be the definitive addition of the DS line of products to some, and it did have a lot of competition that forced Nintendo to throw as many things as possible at the wall to see what would land and cement itself as the better option over a PSP or even an iPhone for entertainment on the go. Nintendo actually intended on releasing this one alongside the DSi, but ultimately they decided to launch it in 2010. This is the DSi XL. The DSi XL was a really cool idea. We actually returned to a glossy top design, which did attract fingerprints still, but the rest of the body was of this matte texture, almost metallic with how gritty its texture really is, which did make it an even better experience for holding it and gripping it properly. Every button, game slot, stylus slot, and such remained in the same location for the XL model as it did with the original DSi model. The buttons are of the same size and they feel exactly the same as well. The only thing that did change was the overall size of the DSi and the size of both screens. So having a larger device did make it feel unwieldy at first, but once you got used to it, it felt much more comfortable than playing on a regularly sized DSi, so in terms of comfort, they knew exactly what they were doing. Both screens were also upgraded to be about 93% larger than the original DSi screens, but the bad news is that these screens are of the same resolution as the DSi's, and of course the DS Lite and DS Original. If you have a larger display with the same amount of pixels, then it means that the same content that looked sharp on smaller screens will look a little less sharp on the DSi XL. As such, games do look a little bit blurrier than they did before, and some might not mind it too much, but I definitely noticed it. And this really only affects you if you're playing normal DS games, not ones that are actually DSi enhanced. Those do look a little bit better. So this just means that the DSi XL is almost an exact replica of the DSi, but it's just been supersized. This unfortunately caused this model to become redundant to many people because there was no real reason to upgrade. On top of that, Nintendo opted to make those who purchased games on the DSi had to purchase those games all over again on the DSi XL if they wanted to play those games, so there was even less of an incentive to upgrade. As such, even though the DSi XL launched at $189, the price of both DSi models ended up dropping by $20 pretty quickly. Because of the size of the XL model and the fact that the original iPad came out in the same year, I even thought that they made the XL model to compete with iPads and other tablets, specifically while the original DSi model was intended to compete with compact devices like a smartphone, or the iPhone even. But this is just an unfounded claim on my part. However, the DSi XL did something very important early on when it came to setting a precedent for future handhelds. Unfortunately, the DSi XL is easily the worst selling model for a variety of reasons, but the DSi XL did release when the DS was already 6 years old and in dire need of a new generation update. The DS line of products is my favorite of all time, mainly because it gave birth to my favorite handheld of all time, the DS Lite. But there was no shortage of incredible experiences to be had on such a unique piece of hardware. As mentioned earlier, the DS came out with native support for all Game Boy Advance games, which caused the last Game Boy model ever released, the Game Boy Micro, to sell very poorly, and as the world already moved on to a better Game Boy Advance experience through the DS. The DS became the actual successor as soon after they stopped making games for the Game Boy Advance and focused solely on the DS. This handheld is one that I don't think Nintendo will ever top. For myself, as it was everything I needed as a kid, and I still hold dearly. The Nintendo DS line of products shattered all records for any handheld ever seen to that point, selling a total of 154 million units worldwide. Every household had one Nintendo DS, even two depending on the family, but the DS became a staple to a lot of people's childhoods. Recently, I had a very heartbreaking experience. Sometime in 2010, my DS Lite finally gave out, and I'm pretty sure that we just threw it away. But I did still keep my games, including a copy of Naruto Path of the Ninja 2 that my best friend gave me sometime in 2009. I played that game a lot as a kid, and I hung onto it for so long. I went on a trip overseas in August of 2024, so last year as of the filming of this video, and I placed a used DS Lite that I purchased off of eBay with my gifted copy of Path of the Ninja 2 in my checked luggage. My mistake here is that I forgot to lock it before sending it off, so when I arrived at my destination, I looked through my luggage and I saw that it was gone. Someone stole my DS Lite before I even made it home, which isn't a huge loss, but they took the game that I had held onto for so long, and that really frustrated me. My save file, my best friend's save file with all of those memories, was officially gone. I know that I have a tendency of being melodramatic in my videos, but this was something that really bummed me out. I wanted to hang on to that gift until the day I died. I had to buy them again, and as of now, I'm still playing through this game to get it to exactly where I had it before, but that's the kind of lasting impact that these things leave. Nevertheless, the DS left an important legacy, one that carried over to Nintendo's next offering. It was about time that Nintendo launched the true successor to the DS, as the PSP remained the most powerful handheld device, and the DS's age was showing by the end of its life cycle. Nintendo's answer to the gaming and smartphone landscape of the early 2010s was such an interesting one, and we had to talk about it very soon, so stay tuned and subscribe for that mini documentary. Thank you so much for watching. Leave your suggestions in the comments for future bite-sized documentaries, and until next time.